Welcome to A Walk Up Broadway. It was back in 2017 that NYU offered a course called Art of the Photo Essay, and I signed up for that course, but unfortunately it was canceled. But I had already come up with an idea for a project, and my idea was to walk the full length of Broadway and take photographs of whatever I found interesting. And subsequent to that, someone at the Big Apple Greeter suggested that I turn it into a talk. So that's what you're going to see today, my walk up Broadway. So this is what Lower Manhattan looked like in the early 19th century. As you can see, the streets were laid out in a rather haphazard pattern, and the city council became concerned about that. They didn't want the city to end up looking like London. So they appointed a commission called the Street Commission to come up with a plan. So in 1811, they did come up with a plan, and it was called the Grid Plan. In this plan, the avenues would run north and south, and the streets would run east and west, perpendicular to the avenues. And actually, they laid out marble markers around on the island so that when buildings were going up, they would know where the streets would be. And you will notice that there is one street that cuts across the grid, and that is Broadway, the street we are going to walk up today. And we are lucky that they left that where it is, because when Broadway crosses the grid, it opens up a big space, letting in a lot of light, which is a very important factor in New York City with all the tall buildings. So, for example, at 14th Street, you have Union Square. At 23rd Street, you have Madison Square, and on up the line, which we will see as we walk. So this is where Broadway starts. It's at the Custom House, which was built in 1907, designed by Cass Gilbert in the Beaux-Arts style. It has 4 statues surrounding the building, and those statues represent the main continents with which the United States was doing the most trading. And before there was an income tax, the revenue for the country came mainly from the customs tax. So over the years, this building transformed itself into something different, namely the National Museum of the American Indian. Just in front of the Customs House, we have Bowling Green. It is the oldest public park in New York City, dating to 1733. At the time, it had a statue of King George, and when the Revolution started, the colonists got together, and in their enthusiasm, they tore down the statue of King George. This is the Cunard building, built for the Cunard shipping line in 1921 in the Renaissance Revival style. You'll notice that the title of the company was carved into the concrete facade. So even though this company left this building long ago, the title remains in place. They had this constructed for a ticket office for the shipping line, and this is what the ticket office looked like. It had mosaics with a nautical theme. And you should know that the Cunard Line was the first shipping company to establish regularly scheduled transatlantic crossings way back in 1840. And you can still cross the Atlantic on a Cunard liner today. This is the Charging Bull, which is a statue designed by the artist Arturo Di Modica. Now, in 1987, the stock market had a crash, and Mr. Di Modica wanted to reinforce his faith in the economy of the United States, and so he sculpted this bull, which is the symbol for a rising stock market. It was originally placed in front of the stock exchange, but they didn't want it, so it was moved over here to Broadway. And it is currently the most visited statue in Manhattan. And behind the bull, you'll notice the Standard Oil building at 26 Broadway, designed by Carrere and Hastings in the Renaissance Revival style. And one of the things I like about this building is that the facade follows the curve of Broadway. Now, the Standard Oil Company was founded by John D. Rockefeller, and it was his descendants who have left a major mark on Broadway, on New York, certainly more than any other family, and most notably in Rockefeller Center. So this is just a picture looking up Broadway, and in the distance you can see the Empire State Building, which stands at 5th Avenue and 34th Street. But when Broadway gets to 34th Street, it is crossing 34th Street at 6th Avenue, which indicates how Broadway cuts across the grid. The American Express Building from 1914 in the neoclassical style. Once again, this is a building where the company has long since left the premises, but the name remains carved in the concrete. And this building is now a New York landmark. This is Trinity Church, located at the foot of Wall Street, designed by Richard Upjohn in the Gothic Revival style in 1846. It's actually the third church that stood on this site. The first church was burned down by the British, and the second church was destroyed in a storm and subsequently torn down. And next to the church, there is a cemetery which dates all the way back to 1697. And the most famous person buried in this cemetery is Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. This is the Equitable Building from 1915 in the Beaux-Arts style. It has a steel frame with a limestone coating. Now, this building plays a very important part in the history of real estate in New York, because when the city council got a look at the actual bulk of this building, they became very concerned that more buildings constructed like this would block out too much light from the streets. And so they developed a zoning code. And the first zoning code was contained within a booklet of 16 pages. The current zoning code takes up 2,000 pages. Basically, they came up with a formula called FAR, which is the floor to area ratio. In other words, how much floor space is related to how much ground space the building takes up. And one of the rules of this zoning was that as buildings got higher, they were to employ setbacks so that they didn't cut out the light entirely. This is Zuccotti Park. It's actually a private park in a public space. Zuccotti Park was the site of the protest called Occupy Wall Street back in 2011. The protesters built a camp that occupied the whole square, and that camp was there for a couple of months before Mayor Bloomberg decided that it had to be dismantled, so he had the police department do just that. And in front of Zuccotti Park, there is a sculpture by Mark DiServo. And just across the street is the Marine Midland Building from 1967. It is currently occupied by Brown Brothers Harriman. And this building is an illustration of another of the zoning laws, which is that if the developer creates a plaza in front of the building, thus creating more light at the ground, the developer is allowed to add stories to the height of the building. And there in front of it, you see the sculpture called Red Cube, designed by Isamo Noguchi. This is the Fulton Center, designed in 2014, and it's one of the subway's newest stations. You will notice by all the symbols in the front that there are many subway lines which converge at this one space. And before this new station was built, there was sort of a warren of passageways that you had to wend your way through to get from one subway line to another. So this station sort of centralized everything and made it easier to find each subway line. And not only that, it created a nice central atrium and invited retailers to occupy the space around it. And at the top is a skylight, which lets in natural light all the way down to the platforms. This is St. Paul's Chapel, another of the famous churches in Lower New York. It's from 1766, designed in the Georgian style, and it is famous because this is where George Washington worshipped. You will recall that New York City was the first capital of the country, so that's why George Washington was in residence. This church has the reputation of surviving two major tragedies. One was the Great Fire of 1776, and the other one was the 9/11 attack. This is the municipal building from 1914, designed by McKim, Mead, and White. And even though it's not on Broadway, you can see it from Broadway. And I included it in this talk because it occupies an important place in the history of New York. Prior to 1898, the 5 boroughs that we are familiar with were actually separate cities. And in 1898, they were all united into Greater New York. And since the city became so much bigger, seemingly overnight, the city council decided they needed a bigger office space in which to administer the building, the city, and so this building was constructed. It's also the first building to have its own subway station, and not only that, but the first Big Apple greeter's office is located in this building. The Woolworth Building from 1913, designed by Cass Gilbert in the neo-Gothic style. It was actually the tallest building in the world for 17 years until 1930, when the Empire State Building took over that title. And of course, like many office buildings these days, they have been converted into apartments, and that's what the Woolworth Building is today. And this is a picture of the lobby, and that's why the building was known as the Cathedral of Commerce, because the lobby is sort of reminiscent of a cathedral. This is Beekman Tower, also not on Broadway, but you can see it from there. It's from 2010, and at the time it was the tallest apartment building in New York. It has since been surpassed by apartments on 57th Street. This building was designed by Frank Gehry, and you can see his signature architecture feature of the undulating facade. This is the Potter Building from 1886. It's in the Queen Anne style. It is made of terracotta, which also acts as fireproofing. And it's certainly a rather ornate building, and it is now turned into co-ops. This is the fountain in front of City Hall. City Hall was constructed between 1803 and 1812. It is actually the third City Hall for New York. The first one was constructed by the Dutch on Pearl Street, and then the second one was constructed in 1700 and located where the current Federal Hall is on Wall Street. The City Hall is the oldest city hall in the United States, and it is in the French Renaissance style. The Broadway Chambers Building from 1900, designed by Cass Gilbert in the Renaissance Revival style, made of granite, brick, and limestone. The East River Savings Bank from 1911, designed by Clinton and Russell in the Beaux Arts style. It was actually the headquarters of the YMCA for a time. The Langdon Building from 1894, designed by William H. Hume in the Romanesque Revival style, made of granite and limestone. .319 Broadway from 1869 in the Italianate style, designed by David and John Jardine. It is actually the remaining building of two identical ones which stood at Thomas Street, and they were known as the Thomas Twins. This is the Cast Iron House at 361 Broadway from 1882, designed by W. Wheeler Smith in the Italianate style. We often associate cast iron buildings with the area known as Soho, but there are also quite a few cast iron buildings along Broadway. And this was once the home of the magazine called Scientific American. 461 Broadway from 1861 in the Italianate style. It's made of a weathered stone surface and freely partitioned round arch windows. This is one of the things that makes these older buildings so unique and interesting to look at. It's the window treatments. You can see just to the right a more modern building where the window treatments are just sort of generically sheets of glass. But on these older buildings, they strike your attention very readily. This is one of the two buildings called the Roosevelt Building from 1873 in the Art Nouveau style, designed by Richard Morris Hunt. He was actually the first American architect to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. It's considered one of the most significant iron front buildings in the world. The E.V. Hogwarts Building from 1856 in the Renaissance Revival style, also cast iron, designed by John Gaynor, and it was inspired by the San Sorvino Library in Venice. This building is notable because it contains the world's first passenger elevator. .502 Broadway in the Renaissance Revival style from 1860, designed by John Kellum and Sons. Once again, notice the window treatments, and on the bottom you have a Bloomingdale's store. The Rouse Building from 1900, designed by Alfred Zucker in cast iron and stone. The Little Singer Building from 1904, designed by Ernest Flagg in the Art Nouveau style, facade made of steel and terracotta. The Cable Building at Broadway and Houston Street, designed by McKim, Mead and White in 1894. Believe it or not, New York once had cable cars, and this building contained the power source to run those cable cars. The Little Carey Building from 1858, designed by John B. Snook. It has a Corinthian cast iron frame. The New York Mercantile Exchange from 1882, designed by Herman I. Schwartzman in cast iron columns with a very deep windows. This was originally the Manhattan Savings Institution from 1890, designed by Stephen D. Hatch. It consists of rock-cut brownstone, terracotta, and red brick. The building was neglected for many years, but it was restored in 1987 and turned into apartments. What else? 670 Broadway from 1873, designed by George E. Haring. It was originally the Brooks Brothers store in rose brick and granite. Is it not lovely in the sunlight? I do not know who designed this building, but if you happen to get hungry on your way up Broadway, you can stop for a burger at Soup and Burger. The Grace Church at 10th Street, designed in the French Gothic Revival style from 1846. Various additions were added over the years. The Cast Iron Building from 1869, designed by John Cullum, built originally for the Scottish textile merchant James McCrary. It is now apartments. 827 Broadway from 1867, designed by Griffith Thomas. This was originally built for the tobacco heir P. Lorillard. And during World War II, it happened to be the home of the abstract expressionist artist William de Kooning. (836 Broadway, designed by Stephen Hatch from 1876 in the Renaissance Revival style. It was originally used for light manufacturing. Another building called the Roosevelt Building at 13th Street from 1894 in the Romanesque Revival style. It is brick with a terracotta addition. Now we come to our first open space. It is Union Square at 14th Street. Union Square opened in 1839 and was redesigned in 1872 by Frederick Law Olmsted, who also designed Central Park. The title Union refers to the union of two major thoroughfares, which are Broadway and 4th Avenue. The square has been the site of many political activities over the years. And there you can see a statue of George Washington emerging from the trees. This was the first public statue constructed in the city ever since the statue of King George was torn down in Bowling Green. It's also the site of a farmer's market on certain days of the week. This is the Flatiron Building from 1902, designed by a Chicago architect called Daniel Burnham. It has a steel frame with limestone and terracotta coatings. It's considered New York's oldest skyscraper. It is in the French and Italian Renaissance style. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, tall buildings were an unusual sight in New York, so people would simply come and gawk at the building. And today, they still come and gawk at this building because it is so unusual. It's called the Flatiron Building because of its shape, but it actually has an official name. Does anyone know what the official name is? It's called the Fuller Building. And believe it or not, this building is currently being converted into apartments. So it's certainly going to have some unusual floor plans. And there's a famous photo of the building taken by Alfred Stieglitz. This is Madison Square Park at 23rd Street, named after the President James Madison. It was the original home, or I should say just to the north of it was the original home of Madison Square Garden. But Madison Square Garden since moved and is now in its third location at 33rd Street. This was actually going to be a huge park in the middle of Midtown, but that plan never came to be because I imagine because development was going on so quickly. And so this was what was left of that plan, simply just 2 square blocks that we now call Madison Square. And just to the east of Madison Square is the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. This building was the tallest building in the world from 1909 to 1913. It's in the Renaissance Revival style, and it's actually a copy of the San Marco Tower in Venice. Rizzoli Bookstore, possibly the most elegant bookstore in New York. It has been located in a number of locations, and I'm not sure if it's there at this point, since this photo was taken in 2017. But I hope you got a chance to at least go into Rizzoli one time to see its beautiful interior. This is the Gilsey House at 29th Street from 1871. It was originally a 300-room hotel, but it went out of business in 1911. And in 1980, it was converted to condos. This is Macy's department store from 1902, designed in the Beaux-Arts style. It's one of the largest department stores in the world. It takes up a full city block. And just next to it is Herald Square, so named because just to the north of it was a newspaper called the New York Herald. South of 34th Street, the square has a different name. It is called Greeley Square. Now, this is an example of Mayor Bloomberg's idea to turn Broadway into a sidewalk cafe, and you can see how successful this idea has been. It's actually been quite successful. The reason why the chairs are empty today is because it's a very cold day. But there are a number of places along Broadway where you can sit in the street, and many people seem to like to do that. This is the Times Tower from 1903. It is the building that was occupied by the New York Times for a period of years. And when the newspaper moved there, they changed the title of the square to Times Square. Does anybody know what the square was called before that? Well, it was called Longacre Square. And one of the unique features of the Times building was the zipper headlines, which showed the latest news developments spinning around the side of the building. In recent years, the building has simply been the background for billboard mounting. But the latest plan is to turn the building into the Times Square Museum, complete with an observation deck. And of course, it is also famous because that's where the ball drops on New Year's Eve. 1470 Broadway from 1906, designed by Marvin and Davis in the Second Empire style. It was originally the Knickerbocker Hotel. And now we'll just take a look at some scenes from Times Square. This is the Army recruiting station. There's a man checking his phone to find out where he is. Statue of George M. Cohan, one of the great composers of the Broadway theater, Give my regards to Broadway, right there in the middle of everything. It even has a store for cereal. The Iridium Jazz Cafe. It's the place where the great guitarist Les Paul played every Monday night before he moved farther downtown to another jazz club called Fat Tuesdays. It even has a church. Now, most Broadway theaters are not on Broadway. They're on the side streets around Times Square. But this is one of the Broadway theaters that is actually on Broadway, and it is fittingly enough called the Broadway Theater. And at the time, it was showing Fiddler on the Roof. Now we come to Columbus Circle with the statue of Columbus up there on his pedestal. This is one of the open spaces that is not called a square, but rather a circle, since it is a traffic circle. And this is the Merchants Gate, which is the southwest entrance to Central Park, which runs from 59th Street all the way up to 110th Street. This is the Time Warner Center, which is also on Columbus Circle, and you can see the statue dwarfed down there in the foreground. This building is the largest mixed-use building in the city. It contains offices, apartments, a hotel, a shopping center, and a theater. When the building was first proposed, there were protests about how high it would be because it was going to cast a shadow into the park. So this was what was described as the compromise height. Lincoln Center from the 1960s. The building is designed in the international style, and the purpose of Lincoln Center was to put all the major cultural institutions in one place. So therefore you see Philharmonic Hall on the right, the Opera House in the center, and the Dance Theater on the left. And just next to Lincoln Center is another theater that's considered part of it. This is Alice Tully Hall, which is a smaller venue for musical performances. Now, when you think of famous apartment buildings, you'll probably think of Central Park West with the Dakota and the San Remo, but Broadway also has some famous apartment buildings, and this is one of them. It's called the Doralton. It's at 71st Street, and it's from 1902, designed in the Second Empire Baroque style. And when it was first built, the architecture was rather controversial. As you can see, it's filled with ornamentation and decoration of a somewhat extreme nature. This is the 72nd Street subway station for what was originally called the IRT subway line. It was the first subway line to run all the way up to 145th Street, and that was starting back in 1905. Now, this station was always overcrowded, so the city decided to build another entrance to it just across the street. And this is what that looks like, and so it did relieve the crowding to a certain extent. This is Verdi Square from 1906. It is a statue of the opera composer Giuseppe Verdi, and the statues that surround him are characters from a number of his operas. The Apple Bank from 1928, designed by York and Sawyer. The building was inspired by the Florentine Medici's Palace in Florence, Italy. And this is what the lobby looks like. It's hard to believe that this is the lobby for a bank, since it is rather grand in its appearance. I would suggest that if you're in the neighborhood, stop in and take a gander at this. The Broadway bus, if you don't want to ride the subway. The Ansonia Hotel from 1904 in the Beaux-Arts style, rather Parisian in its detail. Now, the Ansonia Hotel was once the site of a famous nightclub called the Continental Baths. And the Continental Baths is where such famous stars as Bette Midler and Barry Manilow got their start. And in 1992, the hotel was converted into condos. The Beacon Theater from 1929 in the Art Deco style. The Beacon Theater was originally used for vaudeville performances and movies, but starting in 1974, they had live music performances, and they're still having live music performances to this day. The Apthorpe apartment building at 79th Street from 1906, designed in the Renaissance Revival style. It occupies a full city block, and it is built around a central courtyard. It is named after a fellow named Charles Apthorpe, who owned the land originally as a farm back in the 1700s. Zabar's, probably the most famous purveyor of specialty foods in New York. It is always crowded and full of delicious things to eat. Whenever I walk by, I buy the seeded rye, and it's so good I start eating it right from the bag. It's a very unusual sight right here on Broadway, an independent bookseller selling rare and used books. And I can only hope that he's still there now. The Belnord Apartments at 86th Street from 1908 in the Renaissance Revival style. At the time it was built, it was the largest apartment building in the world, and it is also built around a central courtyard. This is just some of the sites you'll see along Broadway. They're often sidewalk markets for produce and flowers. This is the refurbished subway station for the IRT at 96th Street. The West Side Market. I always wondered what would it be like to pull out the bottom apple and see when they all crash down to the ground. That wouldn't be very nice, would it? This is Strauss Park at 106th Street. It was built in memory of Ida and Isidore Strauss, who were the co-owners of Macy's department store. And the reason why they had a park built in their memory is that they died in the Titanic sinking. And when they were alive, they actually lived just a block away from where this park is. Columbia University at 116th Street. It was originally established as a colonial college by a royal charter from King George, and it was first known as King's College starting in 1754, and it is the oldest college in New York. After the Revolution, the name was changed to Columbia College, and in 1896, it moved up here and became Columbia University. This is what the central part of the campus looks like. It's actually a nice haven from the commotion and noise of the city. And you are looking at the Low Library. And just across the street is Barnard College, originally for just women. It was one of the original Seven Sisters colleges, which were colleges for women. This is one of Columbia's newest buildings. It's a science building, and it's located at 120th Street. As you can see, the architecture is a stark departure from the more traditional architecture of the other buildings. It happens to have a nice amenity in the corner. It's a cafe which is open to the public. Just across the street is Teachers College, founded in 1887. It joined Columbia in 1897. It is the first and largest graduate school of education in the United States. And just across the street is Union Theological Seminary, founded in 1836. It is the oldest independent seminary in the United States. It became affiliated with Columbia in 1928. And this building is in the English Gothic Revival style. It was completed in 1910 and designed by Francis R. Allen. This is the Manhattan School of Music, founded in 1917. It is one of three major music schools in New York, the other two being Juilliard and Mannes. Now, this is where the subway system comes above the ground, and the reason why it does that is because the terrain of Manhattan dips down at this point and creates something that's known as Manhattan Valley. Now, just along that elevated subway line is a block of restaurants that gives New York the title melting pot, and it's that because all of these restaurants are located in just one block. This is the 125th Street Viaduct, which carries the subway line over what I described before as Manhattan Valley. This structure opened in 1904. It has a steel arch that's 168 feet long and 54 feet high. And it continues along Broadway for over 2,000 feet. And just next to it is another new Columbia building. It's the Jerome Green Science Center. Now, from this point farther north, we are not going to see much of anything that could be described as notable architecture. What we're going to see is people going about their life, going to work, doing their shopping, and just living on Upper Broadway. He's a merchant putting his merchandise out on the sidewalk, arranged a little less formally than the apple stacks we saw lower down Broadway. There's a woman hiding her face from my probing camera. Here's a merchant just setting up temporarily for the day on the sidewalk with his goodies. The Broadway malls run along the center of Broadway, thus separating the traffic lanes and creating what could be considered a boulevard. Now, you will recall Trinity Church from Lower Manhattan and the cemetery that was next to it. Well, at some point, that cemetery filled up. And since the church had such foresight, they purchased a piece of property way up here in northern Manhattan so that they could still have a cemetery. And this plot of land was purchased in 1842, and the grounds were designed by James Renwick. It also has the only active mausoleum in Manhattan. Also on the grounds is the Church of the Intercession from 1912 in the Gothic Revival style designed by Bertram Goodhue. The congregation was originally founded in 1846. And the church and the cemetery are all located on the former estate of John James Audubon, the man who's connected with illustration of birds. Now, this is a building I was surprised to find in Upper Manhattan. It's a building that I would more likely picture in Washington, D.C., but here it is. This is the Hispanic Society of America, which was founded in 1904 to promote the art and culture of Spain and Latin America. The building was designed by Charles Huntington in 1908 in the Beaux Art style. And I couldn't help but take this picture looking across the Hudson River because that building on the right is where I live. So I get to look at these sites all the time. This is the Audubon Ballroom from 1912. It was originally the home for vaudeville, movies, and political activists. At some point, Columbia University wanted to tear it down, but the neighborhood rose up in protest and saved the building. It is now known as the Shabazz Center for Business and Technology. It is also notoriously known as the place where Malcolm X was assassinated. Fried pickles, anyone? Presbyterian Hospital, one of the major hospitals in New York, located here on the Upper West Side. They even have something called the Babies Hospital. Whether they still use it for that, I do not know. This is the United Palace, which was originally a Lowe's movie theater. Built in 1930, and it showed movies until 1969. This Lowe's theater was known as one of the 5 wonder theaters in the Lowe's chain, and it was known as that because of its extravagant decor. It is now called the United Palace, which is a church. And there's their invitation to you. Come on in or smile as you pass by. And what I did is to take a photograph as I passed by. This is part of the George Washington Bridge bus station, and before it was recently furbished, it was one of the most forlorn interiors in all of New York. If you went into the waiting room, it was just so dingy. And there were always people there waiting for a bus that would never come. But in recent years, it's been refurbished, and now it's sort of bright and airy, and it's actually a rather pleasant place to be if you happen to be a bus commuter serving the communities of New Jersey. More merchandise on the sidewalk. Broadway has everything. The Social Security Administration, the police department, the Jewish Center. And here we have a school that was designed in such a way as to bring some liveliness to what is usually a rather institutional-looking structure. This building is Intermediate School 218. It was designed by Richard Datner, and it was built in 1990. A funeral home? Public housing? This is Fort Tryon Park from 1935. It was actually a gift of the Rockefeller family to New York City, and it certainly is a pleasant diversion from all the surrounding commercial commotion going on. The nice bucolic setting in northern Manhattan. It is also the location for the Cloisters, which is part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This building was named for the French and Spanish monastic society. Another good-looking school. Now, at this point up Broadway, it receives another designation, which is that it is also U.S. Route 9. Now, figuratively speaking, you can take Broadway all the way up to the Canadian border because that's where Route 9 goes to. Busy, busy, busy. Another interesting looking school. PS 176. And this is a school in the usual institutional design, which is very reminiscent of a prison, which is what many children think school is anyway. Now, this is the most surprising sight I found on my whole walk of Broadway. This is the Dyckman farmhouse from the 1780s. And it was owned by the Dyckman family. And at some point, they decided to sell it to another group of people. And that group of people was going to tear it down. When the Dyckman family found out about that plan, they decided to buy the farmhouse back. And after they purchased it back, they decided to give it to New York City, and it is now a museum which was originally established in 1916. So if you're ever on the upper reaches of Broadway, you should check out the Dyckman farmhouse. And as I mentioned, the terrain of Manhattan often changes. So here you have a rather large staircase, but they helpfully count the steps for you so you don't have to count them yourself. That is, if you're into counting steps. And here we are at the Harlem River, which is where Broadway in Manhattan comes to an end. So thank you very much for coming on this walk up Broadway, and I hope you enjoyed it.